Welcome, everyone. This is the third conversation in our Water is Life webinar series. So this one is called Water, Waste, and Density Climate Conscious Zoning. So we're going to start with a little bit of introductions and then get into the panel discussion. And of course, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll hopefully be able to get towards all of them towards the end of the conversation. So for the Water is Life series, we are tackling the most critical challenge facing island cities right now, which is preparing for and adapting to climate change. So the recent IPCC report projects that declining rainfall, more severe droughts, and more intense hurricane seasons. And water security is and will be the defining issue for all Caribbean islands. And in each of these webinars, we intend to explore the scale of the problem and identify locally relevant solutions that can help us deal with our new climate reality. So for today's conversation, we are acknowledging Jamaica's context of very rapid urbanization and the failure of urban infrastructure to really keep up with that development. So we're going to be exploring the ways in which our land use and our density and regulations either aid or stand as obstacles towards resilience as a city. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Dorian Duncan. I'm one of the founders of Island City Lab. Island City Lab is a Caribbean-based urban think tank that's dedicated to understanding the unique features and challenges of small island cities in the Caribbean. And our aim at Island City Lab is really to improve our built environment by building, fostering, and convening a network of civic thinkers to confront these challenges. And this forum is a part of our programming. So today we are speaking with 3 experts in water, stormwater, and urban planning to discuss whether or not our water infrastructure is capable of meeting the levels of urbanization that we are experiencing across the Kingston metropolitan area. So I see Jenna's in the chat. Great, thanks. So happy that you're able to join. All right. So first we have Basil Fernandez. He served as the managing director of the Water Resource Authority from 1996 till his retirement in 2016. Basil's career represents an almost 50 years of service in the water sector, starting with the Geological Survey Department in 1968 as a geologist, and then moving up the ranks of various iterations of what would eventually become known as the Water Resource Authority. We have Dr. Jenna Blackwood, is a practicing landscape architect and environmental consultant with almost 30 years of experience in the landscape industry. Her PhD research focused on household stormwater management and the structure of stormwater governance in Barbados, in Jamaica, and St. Lucia. She's also an adjunct lecturer at the Caribbean School of Architecture, where she teaches introductory courses in landscape architecture and environmental management. And last but certainly not least, we have Professor Carol Archer, who has more than 25 years of experience in management, education, training, and research in a multidisciplinary and international setting, and is a professor at the University of Technology in Jamaica since 2000. Her passion for community development and service contributed to her receiving the President's Distinguished Award for Community Service at UTEC in 2017. So again, I want to thank you all for joining this conversation and thank our panelists, of course, for being here. So Jordan can pop up the slide, thank you. So for this conversation, we really wanted to explore the ways in which zoning, density, and other land use policies impact water supply, flooding, and wastewater. So particularly, we are referencing the development orders, which now exist for every parish across the island. So development orders, for those of you who don't know, are documents that set out guidelines for planning and development in parishes and communities across the island. It enables the local planning authority to regulate land developments, as well as give directions on things like permits, how permits can be obtained. It also allows them to limit development for special or sensitive areas. Next. And most relevant for this conversation is that the development orders allow planning authorities the ability to set densities for an area. So this means using some sort of metric to influence the amount of people that can inhabit a building or a given area, right? So on screen, you're going to see a density map for the Kingston and St. area. I understand and I apologize. It is a bit complex to see and to understand, but roughly the closer you get to downtown Kingston, which is a little area in pink, the more dense developments can be. So you see that a light blue area is the second most dense, and that includes places like Crossroads. That's followed by purple, which includes parts of New Kingston. Then you have red, then you have gray, and then you have yellow. And then once you reach to that light yellow, most of that area is rural. So with that context, let's jump into the conversation, right? So with all of that background, let's get started with you, Carol. So by 2040, the population of Kingston metropolitan area is set to increase by not more than 4%, right? So given that background, could you talk to the basis of the increase in density that's allowed in development orders, and kind of talk to how water infrastructure and water resources were considered in crafting that policy?
Yes. Well, as it relates to the density considerations for the development order, and particularly the development order for Kingston, NEPA and the Kingston and St. Andrew local authority would have been in constant dialogue, constant collaboration, looking at the land use changes in the Kingston metropolitan area over a particular time period. So the data would have been collected and analyzed to show changes in terms of population. They were also informed by the various and new techniques in planning concepts, you know, the walkable city, concepts associated with the new urbanism, livable cities, and so forth. So using that, the committee that worked on the preparation or updating the development order questioned where would be the ideal areas for increasing density. And based on the data collected and analyzed, based on how we see the city, the Kingston and St. Andrew evolving, then some assumptions were made and recommendations made associated with those assumptions. Let me point out, though, that we had some limitations. Yes, one of the major limitations associated with that is we would have been better informed as to the density changes had we had a national spatial plan. So the national spatial plan would have provided us with a hierarchy of settlements and how those settlements would inform going forward. We did not have that to work with. So as best as we could, we used existing data and project changes. That was one. The other information we used was the where we have infrastructure, both as it with the physical infrastructure primarily in this case. So where we would have access to sewage, water, transportation network, so forth and so on. So in those areas where we had ready access to the existing sewage system, or where the government through NWC and the other organizations dealing with water management in the country, they would have advised us. So, for example, NWC was very clear. There are certain sections of the development, the areas included in Kingston and St. Andrew Development Order, that they were not going to expand the sewage system. Therefore, we could not expand, we would not have recommended expanding the density in those areas because the existing sewage system would not have been able to maintain. So places such as Red Hills, Forest Hills, and so forth. Others where we had, the NWC had indicated how they would have expanded over up to, I believe it was 2035. And based on that, we said, okay, in using that information from NWC, using data projection based on Staten, and also we did field visits. We actually went out and visit some of these communities. And so we made the recommendations on that basis.
Thank you for that. So obviously there's a lot of coordination that was taking place between the urban planners, between the water experts, the infrastructure experts to kind of co-develop this plan.
Absolutely. So, at the time when we prepared the development order.
Gotcha.
And this was in between 2013 up to about 2016, thereabouts.
Okay, perfect. So I want to bring in Basil, who is known as a resident water expert for the island. Basil, be helpful for, I think, everyone on the call to understand your perspective, the current state of our infrastructure, water infrastructure, so particularly potable water and the wastewater infrastructure. I think Carol mentioned that, sewage infrastructure is rolling out. Would like a quick synopsis of where these things are specifically for the Kingston metropolitan area.
Well, I think I haven't dealt much with infrastructure except when I served with the NWC on the NWC's board. But as Carol said, the sewage infrastructure is something that is ongoing, depending on a piecemeal basis, because a number of areas have had sewage pipe laid, depending on the structures that are going up. And if you look along Charlemont Drive, you see that a sewage pipe was laid. A number of other areas in the upper section of Kingston and St. Sewage pipes have been laid, and in certain areas of Mona Heights, there have been sewage systems, pipes that have gone in, which will pick up the sewage from the households along the line. Now, the NWC Act says that they have to charge you the sewage rates whether or not you are connected to the sewage line if you're within a certain distance of that sewage line. So whether or not you are connected, you still have to pay the sewage rate. The water infrastructure in some places is quite old. A lot of it has to do with the laying of small diameter pipelines in history in the past, where they were mostly asbestos cement pipes in a number of areas, and in other areas there were small galvanized or small ductile iron pipes. Over the years, and because of the nature of the soil in the Ligonier area, remember the Ligonier area was once a large agricultural area before housing took over most of the plains, and the lower section of the Kingston and St. metropolitan area, which is the area that is basically divided up into blocks downtown along East Street, on the other streets around that general area. Most of the sewage and some of the pipelines are quite old, made out of clay type pipes and other things which break frequently, so you have a high water loss on a lot of those pipelines. As new infrastructure, as new sources or supplies expanded, then new pipes are going in, and based on the calculated demand, which is like 172 liters per capita per day, then depending on the population of the area intended to be served, that volume of water will go in, plus a percentage for loss and a percentage for peak demand, when, of course, in certain times more water is required, especially in the hot season, than the regular time. The NWC has embarked on a non-revenue water program, which has significantly reduced the volume of losses. These are basically technical losses and some commercial losses. We do have losses not just leaks, but losses in terms of under metering, poor functioning of meters, theft of water. And you'd be surprised to know that it's not just people in downtown Kingston or in some of those areas that steal water, but people in some of the very upper areas. In addition to that, you have a flat rate system in some places, which I distinctly remembered one area when we were charging people for like 3,500 gallons per day or something in that region. When we actually put in a meter, it went up to something like there was actually about 24,000 gallons that was being used per day, because people weren't paying much, so why conserve? And that is one of the issues that we have in terms of meeting the water demand.
Okay.
So reducing the loss and becoming more efficient in the transmission and distribution systems is something that the NWC has undertaken, and I strongly support that program because I think it has the potential to save quite a bit of water.
Okay. So I think that's a very helpful context, right? We're very used to thinking about Jamaica as a land of wood and water, but even though we're the land of wood and water, our infrastructure has limitations. You know, undersizing, that type of capacity issues, the leakage happening from these pipes, which we know are, you know, over 50 years old. So, and NWC is currently underway trying to address those issues. So I think that's a helpful overview. I want to bring Jenna in. Across the corporate area, there is development happening everywhere, which means land is getting paved over. There's concrete, there's asphalt everywhere. Jenna, if you could talk from your perspective as a landscape architect, what is the consequence of this increase in hard, impermeable surfaces across the city? And how is our drainage infrastructure currently managing it? You're muted? Yeah.
Muted, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Sure, thank you. If I could just add to the conversation on the water, the supply and the demand, I just want to also remind people that the environment needs water. So it's not just people who need water. So we need to make sure that, for example, when you look at the Hope Dam, when they capture that water, there's nothing that flows over. So the stream bed below doesn't have the water that it used to. And that has also caused usage lower downstream because people are now not aware that they're actually in a stream bed. So, you know, that's just a consideration as we go forward, and we're talking about how much water there is and we wanting to have water. For impermeable surfaces, I mean, you know, one of the most obvious things is that water is on the surface of the land. It cannot percolate through. Basil can tell you we need the water to go down into the aquifers below. That's one aspect. And one thing is that when the water doesn't filter down and you don't have that ground flow feeding rivers and streams anymore, what happens is that your streams only run when there's rain falling. So like now when we're having rainfall, it's all flooded because all the water is on the surface. And then when we have our drier periods where typically we used to have some kind of ground flow, that ground flow is now less. So you find that your rivers and streams, they dry. One of the other things is that as we see happening now, it's actually raining where I am, so you might hear some background noise, but it floods very quickly. 10 minutes and we suddenly have a flood event because, you know, water is not being, like I said, percolated along with impermeable surfaces, you know, and urbanization. Generally, we cut down all our trees. We're putting up high rises. We're paving it all over. We don't have the trees anymore that used to absorb some of this moisture and send it back into the atmosphere. It's causing us to have microclimate issues. So we're having now a very hot plains because in those areas now you don't have the moisture that's coming from the trees. You don't have any more, and now you have these hard surfaces which are heating up so fast So we've got a very hot plains, and you can feel a distinct difference between the plains and the upper regions. Something that we also don't consider, when the engineers build their drainage structures, they're only concerned with how much water they're going to get off and how quickly they can take it off. And they're not concerned that when it gets down to the harbor or into the stream or wherever it goes, that it scours the land, it takes garbage with it, it takes other pollutants, sediments, pesticides, all kinds of things, and it damages our marine environment. So we have a problem where we rely on the marine environment for, for fisheries and for, recreation, etc. And it becomes unusable because we are not treating the water that is leaving the land. One of the things that, I know Basil was a proponent of this, is the holistic management of water, so that we are managing water. And when we're doing our impermeable surfaces, we're managing everything together. So we're managing runoff and supply and waste, all in an effort to create a holistic and a balanced management of water. Because if you do it like how the Singaporeans do it, every drop of water is potentially potable water. That's how they look at it. So whether it is runoff, or it is coming from the streams, or it is rain, or it is all treatable and potentially, like I said, potable water.
Yeah.
One of the problems that we also have is that people, I think, are not aware sometimes. Everybody is trying, just like how engineers try to get rid of water, people on their individual properties, they also are paving over their properties and sending this water out into the road. And that is also causing a problem for the engineers, because they can't manage that water, which the systems were not built to handle, right? I think there is not that awareness. Well, one thing is awareness, another thing is mandate, that we should be encouraging people to capture some of this rainwater. When you talk about the system as it is and the demand and so on, we have to remember we're living in a changing climate, and it is expected that, yes, we're going to have heavy rainfall periods, but we're also going to have longer drought periods. Mm-hmm. And what happens when you have the longer drought periods? What do you do then when because storage is part of our problem? I
want to break it and just reiterate something that you said a while ago about a very holistic approach to managing water. So that's both drinking water, wastewater, and runoff, stormwater, right? And you said in Singapore, they have this idea that every single drop of rain or any drop that drops anywhere is potentially drinking water. I think there's an understanding that development is leading right now. Lots of development is happening every single place, right? And it seems like the sort of conversations around holistic management of water or infrastructure related to holistic water is lagging behind. So this is a question for you all. What are the consequences of our approaches lagging behind development? So development going far ahead before we have a holistic strategy for how to do with water.
Well, certainly in terms of your lagging infrastructure in comparison to your rapid development of your housing and the increase in density, clearly there are going to be significant impacts. With a high rise, you're going to have a higher demand for water on that one lot, which before had only one single family house containing 5 people. Now you have a high rise of 40 apartments with 5 persons in each or 3 in each. So you have over 100 persons demanding water. The pipeline hasn't changed because you're still transporting the same volume of water that was intended to serve the individual houses
Mhm.
along that road or that area. So you have an impact in terms of probably lower pressures in some places, and maybe the apartment might get a bigger diameter pipeline going into the apartment, depends on who is building the apartment, you know. But there is going to be a big impact in terms of the water supply. In terms of runoff, though, what we find is that when you have increased densities and you don't have the smaller, lower densities, you find that the runoff decreases simply because you are reducing the number of individual housing to just this one apartment building. So you'll have a reduction in the runoff. I think the runoff can also be reduced further if you put systems in place to allow for infiltration into the soil to recharge the aquifer. And on the Ligani Plains, where you're sitting on top of a sand and gravel with clay aquifer, you can easily recharge by allowing the water to infiltrate into the alluvial material. And there are ways of having a good area around there without total paving, like no blacktop, no concrete, basically. If you look up at the university or the management building, you'll see many years ago, they put systems in place with blocks where provide you some basis, some firmness on the parking end, but still areas with grass and things that allow water to infiltrate inside there.
So Basil, I know you spoke about the water, but there's also the management of wastewater that is seriously impacted by this increased density. Because as we saw when we were preparing the development order, where NWC, well, there are a couple of things here. One, there was the expansion and the creation of Soapberry, the central water wastewater treatment company. And I think the intention was that new development and existing development would be connected to the central system. There are some developments that are going now that are not connected, even though they ought to be connected. And there are existing developments that, even though they are being charged for wastewater, they are not connected. So can you imagine, Basil mentioned about the Ligani aquifer, the wastewater, because it is not going into the central water treatment facility, where is it going? Yes, and when you have more of this happening, when you have increased density, because if you look at the development order, the areas in Red Hills, they, I believe for the most part, those were to be remained in that existing 30 habitable rooms per acre. But the existing or the new development that we see coming up, that's not the case. So then we have to ask, what will happen to the sewage if it's not being properly managed? Because the development, especially the new developments, they are not going according to this piece of legislation that says this is how development ought to take place in the particular area.
Well, I think the NWC has the right to refuse a development, you know, if the development is going to be in an area where they cannot properly manage both water and sewage and make the supply available without being detrimental to other persons who are still living in the area. And they cannot allow the sewage to go into a soakaway system, which though it out of sight, it is certainly not going away because it goes to the water table.
I can't recall a development being refused in Kingston over the past 5 years by NWC saying, no, we don't have the facility, we don't have the infrastructure to support it. Is that correct, Basil? I can't recall that ever happening. And given the extent of the approvals that we've been following over the last year or two, especially in places like Reading, I think we have to ask, what is then the NWC going to do with development in these areas?
I don't have the information to be able to conclusively say that they have refused. But I know that there's a unit in NWC, and they have been very strong in the granting permission, and they will not give permission if they can't handle the system. Or they can work with the developer who will pay what is known as an impact fee to the NWC to put the necessary infrastructure in, or to upgrade the infrastructure to be able to take that development. So maybe they haven't refused, but when you go into the details, the developer has paid to improve or expand or put in new infrastructure to be able to accommodate that development. Which is something that I think has happened over the years. And so
but with the developer, I'm sorry, Basil, if just to continue the discussion, if the developer is paying and saying, okay, I'm going to do it, then NWC is not able to. We can only imagine then that both NWC, NEPA, and the local authorities are collaborating to ensure that what the developer, the infrastructure that the developer is putting in meets the requirements, so that at the end of the day, both the relevant authority that would manage the infrastructure afterward is in a position to do so.
Yes, but the developer does not go off and do the infrastructure development by himself. He is given a plan by the NWC usually, and I speak because I know what of this has happened, basically, is that he gets the design from the NWC as to what is to be put in and what the funding is going to take, and he puts the money up to the NWC, and the NWC may put that in and develop it, because it has to be able to merge with the existing systems that the NWC have to ensure that it is manageable. And therefore, that's what the NWC aims for. And I think the local government authorities also would like to prefer to see that.
Okay.
It's more of an integrated type of development that they're looking.
Agreed. So I want to kind of transition the conversation, right? So we talked about the consequences of our infrastructure and our approaches to a more integrated water management, lagging behind all of the urban development taking place, right? So now we want to talk about solutions. What are some of the global practices that you all are seeing, whether in infrastructure or creative funding strategies, that you think would be relevant for Jamaica at this point of the pace and the speed in which our cities, both Kingston, St. Catherine, and Montego Bay, are developing? Jenna, you want to start with that?
Sure. One of the things that, or two things that I'm aware of, one is the holistic management, like I mentioned, but that would require either all the entities, because now we have different entities, different agencies managing different components. So we have to, find that way of whether we are going to have one of them taking everything, or have a more collaborative approach to have it managed a bit more holistically. I know that in Barbados, where I was recently, they have an approach where they're looking at it from a climate resilience point of view. And so in doing their flood control and rainwater harvesting, they're looking at it from a climate resilience point of view, and they've gotten international funding to do that. So if you marry it into some of the climate change strategies that are around, You know, people are now talking about, for flooding, they're talking about nature-based solutions and things like that, where you're using more natural systems. Then you can find ways of improving your water supply, dealing with floods, but also getting the funds to do it, which is always what our challenge is. We're always, you know, saying we don't have the funds to do it. So you've got to play into the things that exist out there.
The thing is, we have to have a whole series of solutions. There's not one single solution that's going to work. So we have to look, first of all, in the development that's going in. One, when are we going to force the developer, for want of a better word, I think we should force them to put saving devices.
Yes.
Yes.
Mandate would be the.
No, I don't think mandate. You mandate people and they don't do anything. You have to force them. And when you force them, is that there have to be consequences if they don't do it. That's what force is. Right. So basically, you have to look at water saving devices within the apartment itself or the complex that is going in. So we have to reduce the demand for water. Now, NWC practices a supply management, in that if you don't have the water, then lock it off. The idea of demand management is something that needs to be explored. And in many parts of the United States, and I can name you many cities who have gone into demand management and who has reduced the demand for water. And even during the drought of 13-14, when it was very severe in the USA, there are many cities who was able to meet their demand based on whatever water they had in storage. And believe me, when you see what storage is like now in the US in some of those big dams, you're worried. But you have to look at how you can save water internally. And the utility company has to work with the customer outside in terms of putting systems in place. You may be able to, the utility company put the systems up front, put the installations up front, which the household or the client will pay over time and their water bill and pay off for that installation that is put inside there. Yes, it's a utility company to sell whatever they're selling, but they can do much better and more efficient and reduce their demand. It also comes down to the fact that the wastewater that comes out will also be reduced. So you may not need an additional wastewater treatment plant if you're reducing the volume plus the quality of wastewater. So we have to look at how we can actually go about and save water. But it's got to involve both the developers and the agencies themselves, and people have got to understand that. Right. So you have to.
Right. And even the collection of the water, because most of the developments you see going up, what they have is they put a black tank. But the black tank is not, the NWC water is going to the black tank. There's no way of collecting water, rainwater. So this whole concept of rainwater harvesting, it is a policy written in the development order. I think we need to now go a step further by working with the developers, by looking at the different approaches to rainwater harvesting. It can't be that, okay, I have put up a black tank and, you know, I am good with water. There should be the provisions given for construction of whether it's retention ponds or within the building, ways of collecting water so that it can be reused either for some basic consumption or back to green space or other types of water.
But I just had a follow-up point. It seems like there's a issue of enforcement and enforceability of some of these things, right? So we can say in the development orders that it mandates rainwater harvesting, but that's not being enforced. But also, is there a sort of awareness? So young people, whoever is buying these apartments, buying these households, do they know that this is supposed to come with it? Or do you think that consumers and people who are shopping around know these things?
Basically, that one of the things is that they are frozen in time. So what I think basically is that sometimes adding rainwater harvesting systems, which is the creation. Let's look at the USVI or the BVI or Bermuda or anywhere like that, for instance. Is simply that you have to construct a cistern before you build a house. And the cistern has to be a certain size depending on the size of the house that you're going to build in, right? And that is going to add to the cost of a house. Now, government, I think, has shied away from forcing people to put rainwater harvesting in place and things. And as you said, it's mandated in the development order, but again, it comes back to that you mandate something, but nothing is done, so the enforcement isn't there. But basically, once you put those rainwater systems in place, then you can use it for different things. In many of the houses in USVI, for instance, people use that rainwater that is harvested for everything in the house except drinking. Drinking water is bottled water that is sold separately, and you use it, but you find it. And I think in Bermuda, you do the same thing is happening inside of Bermuda. So we have to look at it. Now, culture is a hell of a thing. Just as how we talk about using wastewater, and people in the United States have seen treat wastewater, and in Singapore, treat the wastewater, put it back in the drinking system, and it's recycled back to people. People in Jamaica don't want to get rainwater harvesting and do rainwater harvesting. They view rainwater harvesting and water from tanks as a slide down the slope that you're going down. They want pipe water, even when it's not economical or technically feasible to transmit the water over some hill and gully and all sort of place. They still want pipe water. No farmer wants to use treated effluent for irrigation purposes. I remember years ago we had an experimental system out in Caymanas using water from one of those sewage treatment plants built out there before Soapberry, and it was being done by the Dutch, and there was a Dutchman here who was working with Water Resources Authority, and we used the rainwater. And I think Dr. Conrad Douglas worked on a project up at SRC on the same thing also. Yet not one single farmer would eat a piece of cane irrigated with treated effluent. Everybody else was eating it. The Dutchman was eating it, we were eating it, but not one of the farmers that wanted it. And this culture thing comes right back to that. Unless we can get over that culture thing and guarantee to people that when effluent is treated, it's going to meet a certain standard that is not going to be implicated or impacting their health or their crop. Then is something that we have to get over. But that culture is a big thing.
I completely agree with you. And I do understand that both policies and governance influence culture, and culture also influence both of those things. So I do think both of them need to work at the same time, right? And so shifting to this other question is, do we currently have the governance structures to ensure that we are developing our cities in a resilient and sustainable way? Carol, can go ahead first.
I don't believe so. This is something that I have been paying close attention to in terms of my research, looking at governance system that is required for the type of urban development that we would want in Jamaica. For one thing, the issues of coordination. Yes, there is, and I have the data to suggest that there is agencies and entities often trip over each other when it comes to who to do what and who to make the decision. Yes, it is not very clear. So that coordination is needed. Transparency, which is a key principle of governance, is also absent in many, many regards. So when an approval is when a client apply for approval, one of the things that we see in which is supported by the new urban agenda, which is the framework for goal, implementing goal 11, that this information should be readily available. We should allow for the citizens to have their say in how the development impacts them. That is not happening. I applaud the KSAMC. It was said recently that they would provide this information for us to see where certain developments and they're at the stage of approval. But I think it needs to be much further than that. And finally, as part of the governance process, I would want for us to involve the professionals more in the decision making. As it is now, well, you go elsewhere and you'll have a land use commission, and that is staffed and supported by persons trained in land management, and that recommendation, and it is independent, yes. They're appointed by government, but that whole process of appointment is very open, very transparent. So you don't have that political stronghold that you tend to find in our system. So if we were able to put those measures in place, one of the things that I've recommended coming out of my research is a new framework for the approval process, somewhat independent, but very supportive and collaborating with the administrative and political structure as it relates to land use management. And that will assist in the whole governance process necessary for the type of development we want to have in Jamaica.
Totally. I just want to add one point to that. Throughout that kind of development process, there's still a bottleneck at the minister, right? So several agencies can potentially say, we don't think this development works. This doesn't make sense for X, Y, and Z reason. But at the end of the day, the minister.
Which is why I'm recommending that independent. Yes?
Gotcha. Makes sense.
Body with staff, with professionals who the professionals are respected. Yes?
Understood. Then I want you to pick up on that, but particularly could you talk about the community contribution, how communities are involved there?
I was going to add to what Dr. Archer said about the inclusion and all the players being involved. So you have the agencies, you have the professionals, you have the communities. Everyone has a part to play, right? In getting all of this done. You have incentives. Right now, everything is so punitive, right? There's nothing to encourage people to say, put in your this, put in that, and education and awareness. There's also the idea, I think, sometimes, and there's a disconnect. Like in some of the research that I did, when you speak to the agencies, they say, oh, we have spoken to communities, we have engagement with the communities, we have town hall meetings, we have all these different things, right? It is given an opportunity. But when you speak to the communities, they will tell you, they don't listen to what we say. They're told exactly. So these interventions they only come about when the agency wants to go to them and maybe tick a box to say, okay, we've done our consultation. But it's not really an engagement where they're seeking this from the community and the community feels that they are part of this, of the whole process. And so there is this disconnect that happens, this divide, right? The methods that are used and the outcomes, the communities really don't feel that they have a part in it, or they're being taken seriously. And the truth is that they are the ones being affected, right? So they're the ones, like Basil says, who don't have water for days. When a new development comes in, they're the ones with traffic problems. They're the ones, but they're not brought to the table. or they don't feel that they're brought to at the table in a meaningful way.
You know, in the National Water Sector Policy, which was developed some couple of years ago, there is the establishment, calls for the establishment of some integrated community councils, which would be useful in terms of managing water resources across the island of Jamaica. And a lot of that has to do with, in many instances, you don't hear about anything happening from an agency, you hear about it happening from persons in the community. And we feel that if those persons were involved in the actual management and you had a formal council set up where we had regular meetings to discuss the issues, and and of course, a lot of people in some of these rural areas have a better idea of what they know can work.
Happens on the ground.
Yes. So therefore, it's time that we do include them in our discussions. And inside of the National Water Sector Policy, there is the call to establish those councils.
Okay,
I just want to point out that nationally, I think an education program is really critical for many areas. And we are looking at climate change. People don't seem to understand exactly what is going to happen.
Agreed.
And how it's going to affect our water resources.
It is happening. It is happening.
Right, it's happening.
It's happening.
And how we can utilize treated effluent, because treated effluent is a resource that should not just be discharged to Kingston Harbor in Kingston or anywhere else, but should be utilized as in, because even when you have climate change.
Sorry to break you, Basil, but I know that we're at time and there are a couple questions in the chat I just wanted to get in. If anyone needs to hop off, thank you so much for joining, but we're going to spend hopefully the next 5 minutes and get through a couple of these questions. Renelle Sargent in the chat was asking, and if we can keep the answers really brief and succinct. Carol, I think this one is for you. How can these governance changes be implemented? Is it through a specific legislation? Is it through policy? And where are the starting points?
Right. Well, I know opportunity exists. As we speak, we are reviewing the Town and Country Planning Act. And the TCPA Act, I believe persons who had reviewed it initially, one of the things that they're recommending is this to change the whole issue of participation and ensuring that we have this is what we're going to do, but let's come together and discuss how to do it. So that's one piece of, there are several pieces of legislation. TCPA Act needs to be one of them. And also to review the powers that we give to ministers for them to make the ultimate decisions. I think we really need, if we're talking about governance, governance is not where the minister makes the ultimate decision. Power should be where they facilitate the development of these policies and legislation, right? Not to be the sole person. That's the role of parliamentarians, to do legislation, not to determine where, whether development where development should go.
Totally.
So
John,
I think those are some of the points, places we could start.
John, I think this one is for you. There are kind of two comments. Richard Coutu, apologize if I mispronounced your last name. He was making a comment that the development order doesn't necessarily mandate things like rainwater harvesting. It says the development should consider things like that. And Jessica was asking another question around what are some of the incentives, specific incentives you think you could offer developers, but not just things like rainwater harvesting, but green infrastructure, capturing stormwater on site. What are some of the policies that you've seen or incentives that you've seen work elsewhere, Jenna?
Some of what some people use in other places, they use, well, I don't want to say, well, taxes. You can tax, say for stormwater, if you have a certain paved area, There are places where they have, based on the amount of green area that you have in your yard, your development, there's a different tax rate, right? You could get a different tax rate for that. There are other things where people have said, you know, in some of the other work that I've done, that they don't want money, but if there was, say you go to a hardware store and you could get a discount on buying a tank, or you could get, you know, assistance. Actually, one of the things that people asked for was information. So a lot of people said, you know, in some of these cases, to set up a whole system, sometimes they think it's complicated, or they think they need to treat it. And so it comes back to the education, but they need the assistance, the professionals. And that was one of the things that I had suggested, that maybe our professional organizations, our architects and our engineers could be, you know, giving more information to people, whether it's through some kind of a clinic, you know, where you can come and bring your problems, or whether it's through information booklets, or whatever the mode is, to assist them, right, in becoming more aware.
Okay, we have a lot of NWC questions I just want to add. Basil works at WRA, not NWC, but I'm going to ask him this question anyways. Jessica Lewis asked, has there been any sort of research or feasibility understanding around reusing either black water or gray water? You mentioned for agricultural purposes, but has there been any research into potentially industrial reuse of gray or black water?
Yes, there has been. And there's documentation on that, basically, both in terms of sewage effluent as well as other industrial effluents. And in fact, if you look in the sugar rum industry, you will see that Donda is now being utilized in terms of fertile irrigation, mixing with irrigation water. And because of the high organic content being used on sugarcane, so you reduce the inorganic fertilizers, one. Two, if you look in the bauxite alumina company, you'll see that they're taking back as much as possible the water that comes off of the red mud, which is utilized back into the plant itself and reduces their bottom line, so that they become more efficient in that way. So yes, there is a lot of work and a lot of research that has been done. I think
just is there any policies that would prohibit, say, a residential or someone who has their house to reuse gray water, say reusing your laundry water for something else? No policies that prohibit that.
No, in fact, number of places that people have done is to run a pipeline from your gully basin, where all your pipes discharge into the gully basin before going down into your pit. There's a connector pipe there, and run it out onto your lawn or into a grass area or a green area where you have that can irrigate your area. And it's something that we ought to look at.
Perfect. So I want to thank all of the panelists. I know that we went over time, apologies. But thank all the panelists so much for participating. Basil Fernandez, Dr. Jenna Blackwood, Dr. Carol Archer for participating in the conversation and staying on when power kicked us off. And everyone else who showed up for the event. And lastly, the Water is Life webinar series is continuing. We have one last event coming up. We haven't set a date yet, but it's going to be about the relationship between water and food. We're going to talk about urban agriculture and the potential for urban agriculture across the island. So I want to thank you all for joining us. I wish we had more time for Q&A, but thank you all so much. Hopefully we'll see you again in the next event. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.